particularly how you transform infrastructure to achieve our climate ambitions. And we yesterday talked about resilience of infrastructure. So this is a building forward on the kind of things we were discussing yesterday. Let me introduce Simone Rossi, welcome, who is Chief Executive of EDF Energy. Welcome, Simone. Mike Haigh, welcome, who's CEO of Mott MacDonald. I hope their jobs are secure.
I worry that my job's not secure when I hear some of the things our young professionals are doing.
I should have asked them, actually, before they left the room, whether your job is secure or whether they have a view. And Steve Demetriou, CEO of Jacobs. Welcome, Steve. And joining us from Singapore is Yvonne So, who's Executive Director of the Singapore Green Building Council. So welcome, Yvonne, particularly as it's rather late in the evening where you are, but we much appreciate it. Yeah. What we would like to hear from in the next 40 minutes is the biggest obstacles you're facing at the moment on challenging on infrastructure, particularly. So let me ask you about the hurdles to transforming infrastructure for the climate change challenge, but which is really a climate emergency, as we've heard again emphasized by Heather in the last session. Can I ask, Mike, can I ask you, because of the role you play and the kind of contracts you do and the kind of work you're doing on infrastructure, what are the hurdles and the bottlenecks and the obstacles that you're still facing? And as we heard from Kathy, you don't take some jobs because you don't believe they're going to be sustainable.
I think, yeah, in terms of...
Lift the mic up.
Oh, how's that? In terms of the hurdles that we face, I think, you know, there is a reality that we have a lot of technology already in engineering and infrastructure engineering that can be used to solve a lot of the problems that we've got today. So in fact, I do feel sometimes that we're somewhat held back from using the skills and the technology that we've already got, especially in the area of general kind of decarbonisation. And for me, you know, the barrier is often around the relationships between the various parties that are delivering infrastructure. So in terms of capital infrastructure, new infrastructure, to really get the most efficient delivery, the lowest carbon delivery, the cleverest solutions, I think it requires owners, operators, designers, constructors to work very closely together. And unfortunately, I think in many of our traditional ways of delivering infrastructure, we create barriers between these people who actually care desperately very often about climate change. As you say, it's an emergency. And they have great skills around decarbonisation, but it's difficult to deliver if you can't break down the various barriers. I can certainly think of examples where my background originally is in the water sector. And the water sector in the UK has been quite strong in building alliances, building integrated delivery teams. And it is amazing what you can do when you have an operator, a designer, and a constructor looking at a problem and thinking about what the solution should be, rather than just looking at what the piece of infrastructure should be that's created. So by working much more in alliance, by transforming those boundaries, you can start to identify lower carbon solutions. So I'd like to see the barriers in the industry coming down between the various parties that deliver.
But are those barriers adequately identified?
I believe that they are adequately identified, yeah.
Well, let's go to the Singapore experience, to Yvonne. So, Yvonne, the barriers we were hearing there from Mott MacDonald, do you see them as well? I've spent a lot of time in Singapore. You have an incredible infrastructure in so many ways. What kind of principles are you adopting, but what kind of barriers as well, given you're actually trying to expand the island in order to accommodate what is needed by Singapore?
I think for Singapore, the greatest challenge is probably for us the lack of clean or renewable energy. It's, you know, because we're really small, we're really dense, and there's been an extensive study to look into how we can deploy solar to the greatest extent possible. And it showed that, you know, if we were to cover like every roof space, water bodies, and every available vacant land with solar panel, we can only meet about 5 to 8% of our energy needs. So that's why I don't know if everyone knows about it, but Singapore ranks really lowly on the net zero targets, and it's not because there's a lack of will, but we just don't have any viable solutions. So I think that for us is one of the toughest problems. But if I may add, our national grid operator is actually collaborating with EDF to see if we can bring in renewable energy from Indonesia. And there's also another Australian-Singapore venture that's trying to lay some undersea cables, I think the longest in the world, to bring renewable energy from Australia to Singapore. So maybe there's some hope there. But even then, I think we're looking at 45% of our energy needs by 2030 through these means. So I think that is the greatest challenge for us to decarbonize our activities.
Yvonne, can you just literally, very briefly, you have been involved in a massive infrastructure construction, which has been the shifting of the Port of Singapore, the PSA, from its traditional place alongside downtown, way out to the west. What have you learned from that when it comes to achieving your climate ambitions, particularly in the design of the port and the need for almost no labor?
Oh, I wasn't I don't have direct role in it, but I think in everything that we do, there's a lot of time and effort taken to um, plan the work in such a way as to maximize the outcomes. Whether is that in the use of circularity principles to reuse some of the material, some of the waste that's generated, or to use it as an opportunity to test bed new solutions. So we are quite we embrace new technology very very readily, and there are quite a few grants and all that for to test out new ideas, prototypes, and all that. So we see all of these as opportunity to test out new solutions. Yeah, and very welcoming of getting Singapore to be like an open laboratory to for companies to test new solutions in.
All right, good. The sound is not very good, so I'm just explaining to everyone in the hall here and people online. It's quite, it sounds like there's a bit of feedback, so I'm just warning you, so forgive us if we struggle a little bit to hear what you're saying. Let me just get, Simone, I'm going to come to you in a moment because you have specific issues from EDF, but can I just ask Steve for your view from Jacobs about where the challenge is on infrastructure, on transforming infrastructure, what you're seeing from your clients?
Yeah, well, what we're seeing from our clients, we talked a lot about it in most of the panels the last several days where mayors are talking to the private sector is take cities around the world, 60% of global emissions occur in the cities, infrastructure around those cities. And over the last several decades, the majority of the projects have been worked in silos. You know, a rail project, a water project, you know, building on what Mike was talking about, that if we're going to tackle this humongous climate change initiative, it's going to have to be cross-cutting. We're going to have to connect all of these rather than doing them individually and find synergies. Synergies that not only lead to climate response and net zero, but social value and all the other elements that the community wants. And so the bottom line is we got to stop thinking about infrastructure and think about people and places and outcomes that are going to satisfy the communities.
And the issue of climate change or the climate emergency and sustainability.
Right, and so that's, when we think of climate change, we have to think really sustainability. It's the whole ESG, not just the environmental side.
Now, Simone, let me come to you because you have a monster project down in Somerset, which is Hinkley C, which is the new nuclear reactor, which is being built there on a site where there is already a big infrastructure, and you're expanding it. You've awarded £10.6 billion worth of contracts, 22,000 people working on the project across Britain, and you're hoping there'll be other projects to follow. And I have to put that in because it's a very complex issue being discussed by the British government, particularly with the the People's Republic of China. Now, we're not going to go into that, but let's talk about the infrastructure issues. What you have discovered and how you've had to change your planning at Hinkley to accommodate the real pressures now on infrastructure and expectations when it comes to sustainability.
Yeah, so I'd like to say that mentioning some of the hurdles that we need to jump. One is to restart and create the industrial supply chain to be able to realize this project. The last time in the UK a project like that was accomplished was about 25 years ago, and it's surprising how those skills can be lost. So to get these 22,000 people to be up and running and performing to target, to quality, to cost, to time, it's a hard slog. But we hope that by building this, the next project will be easier and will be, in a way, relying on this supply chain which is being rebuilt across industry. Just a couple of words to say that all this beautiful electricity that we have today, that it keeps the lights on and we have this beautiful screen and all these communications, we will need more of it and in the future, as electrification has to pervade transport and heating and other sectors. And today, about half of this electricity, about half of it comes from low carbon. And in the future, we'll need more of it, and all of it will have to be low carbon. So we will need about 4 times as much low carbon electricity than today. But that is a massive undertaking. It will require a hell of a lot of renewables, a hell of a lot of many, many things. But it will always include a component of nuclear, of new nuclear, which is a very specific technology. And coming to infrastructure and hurdles to jump to make it work, it has its own hurdles, it's fair to say.
I should underscore a bit of data as well, that your power from low carbon will power enough for 6 million homes. So a massive project like Hinkley still only provides electricity for a modest number of homes compared to the overall national demand in the UK. But let me take it further, and I saw nodding among your 2 colleagues. What about how you've had to change your design, change your work practices, keep innovating in order to meet what is real public concern about the sustainability of just the construction project, quite apart from atomic energy?
I see. So I have to be very transparent with you. We haven't changed our construction practices.
But you review them.
But we review them. We're actually planning to change them for the next project. For example, for Sizewell, if it goes ahead, we are exploring to use hydrogen as opposed to diesel to power the buses and the trucks on site. Clearly, hydrogen has to come from a green source to begin with. Otherwise, you're simply displacing the problem. But just to give you an idea, once the station is up and running, it produces for every kilowatt hour about 5 grams of CO2, which is really very little. And of that, only about 1 comes from the construction phase. So I have to say that the construction phase, we are very careful. We do our best. But in the future, we expect to replace some of the fuels that are being used with more sustainable fuels, for example. But it's also true that there is a lot of concrete and a lot of steel in these stations. So the concrete and the steel, for the time being, are still manufactured, you know, the way concrete and steel have been manufactured over the last maybe century. So there is a huge parallel, challenge across industries to say, how do we manufacture steel? How do we manufacture cement in a manner that is more sustainable? That is trickier because it requires a lot of heat, high-grade heat, and so for the time being, in most parts of the world, it's still done by burning coal.
But I need to ask everyone, you've got immense buying power. You're a massive civilian project, but there is now new steel, which is probably carbon-free, which is being produced in Sweden. It seems to be working. Same with cement. Things are changing. You have the power, even if you have to pay a bit more, to acquire materials which are produced in a more sustainable way. Is that what you're going to do?
You're right. We will certainly look into that. Of course, some of these materials has to be procured close to where the site is, or in some cases even manufactured on site. But certainly those techniques are very promising, I agree with you, and we would certainly explore the ways to adopt them to the greatest extent, to improve also the way in which these infrastructures are built.
let me ask, what's the view from Mott MacDonald about the need to transition because the technology is moving fast?
Yeah, so clearly there, the decarbonisation thing is happening very quickly. We're seeing massive technology shifts in terms of green cement and green steel and so on. But I do think it's really important, and this is, for me, this is fundamental, that decarbonisation, yes, electrification, this is part of our future. But we shouldn't forget about resilience and resilience of our communities and infrastructure, but also circularity and how we use materials in the world. And so it's one thing talking about decarbonising a material, but we can also talk about using that material in a more efficient way or using different materials, which really goes back to what Steve was saying and what I was saying before, is that we have to look at our infrastructure in a much more joined up kind of way. We can't anymore look at transportation or buildings or cities more generally without looking at energy and the energy transformation. So we have to look at everything together in order to minimize the amount of infrastructure that's required in order to do what's necessary to provide great social outcomes for those communities that we serve. So I think technology is massively, massively important, but we mustn't forget that we can also think about the amount of construction that we do, about the scale of the infrastructure that we put in the ground.
Do please send your thoughts, if you want to, on the app, because I'd like to include those in the conversation. I've got several interventions already. Yvonne, I saw you nodding agreement there with what Mike said.
Yeah. So I think what we really lack are standards as well. When we talk about using recycled materials and promoting circularity, I feel that what's really lacking now are technical standards for acceptance of quality, of safety issues, and all that. Yeah. So for the construction sector, we've been like reusing all of our recycled concrete as we tear down old buildings and build up new ones. And today we've like achieved close to like 100% diversion from landfill for all of our construction waste. Yeah, but this wasn't an easy journey. The setting up of quality standards was really important to ensure that engineers are comfortable as well with the quality of the recycled materials.
Quick question though, how much do you feel under public pressure? There's a certain kind of politics in Singapore, and you obviously have a party which has been in power for a long time, the PAP. Is the concerns of the public now much more evident? Are you feeling it at the Green Building Council?
Yes, we are. So public policy has definitely taken a shift to be a lot more inclusive and collaborative. And just earlier this year, we had an exercise to develop the next Green Building Master Plan for Singapore, which will take our plans to 2030. And this exercise was actually a joint effort by the Building and Construction Authority together with the Singapore Green Building Council. So, it was a public-private kind of a joint venture. And we involved the voices of the public by actively polling for views and reaching out to youths and environmentalists. Yeah, so it was a very different approach now, and people really want to be part of that process and have their say in, what they see to be the future of the country and how they want the living spaces to be and all that.
All right, thanks, Yvonne. Let's move on to a couple of the questions. There's one, I can't see a name here actually at the moment, Kirsty, but it's, I think for all of you, does efficiency not counteract companies' policies of becoming carbon neutral if the materials are still being utilized in infrastructure and not being replaced by newer materials? What's your view, Steve?
Yeah, look, I think efficiency is part of the equation, but I think it's a bad excuse of maybe why things aren't moving faster, because going back to your question about what's going to have to change and bring in new ideas, new technology, the solutions exist, but the biggest issue that's facing the world right now on getting going faster is leadership. And it's coordinated leadership from the client side, the user, all the way to the people bringing the solutions. And where we see the most advanced opportunities is where, the clients that we work with, that they view Jacobs bringing solutions, not billable hours or just trying to make money, that we're trying to bring a solution for the world, and they're open-minded to change. And in many cases, we're bringing solutions by partnering with others. It could be partnering with Mott, could be partnering with big data companies, digital providers, natural solutions, et cetera. But it's going to take leadership to accept it and get on with it. And I think that's when you talk about the biggest barrier, I think it's culture versus technical solutions.
So when you hear about the draft document for the end of this week, which is already delaying things for another year,
right,
that is not sending the kind of signal you believe is necessary for the urgency of what is faced.
Yeah, I mean, at the end, whether it's climate change or any other initiative, it really does come down to leadership and a sense of urgency and accountability. And I'm hoping that by the end of this week, we're going to get positively surprised that, there's going to be some pressure over the next couple of days to really put some accountability out there to truly make things happen, measure it, and set rigorous KPIs so we're not where we are today looking back 5 years ago, and most of the things we talked about 5 years ago we're still waiting to happen.
I just build on that. So I think the question was about efficiency and infrastructure, and to get the most, there's a big question at the moment that I think we're all facing, and that is how to get the most out of the existing infrastructure that we've already got. Yvonne talked about reusing infrastructure, reusing buildings, and so on. So I think for me, we've got this very complicated infrastructure around the world, and every bit of infrastructure connects with another bit of infrastructure. We've got airports, we've got roads, we've got railways, we've got buildings, and of course, cutting across the whole thing, we've got the people that use it. How do we work out how to get the best out of the existing infrastructure in a very, very complicated world? Well, actually, we've got one tool already, and that is to use data, to use digital information to create effectively what you might call digital twins of that infrastructure. It's massively complicated, and trying to understand it without digital twins is impossible. But if we had true digital twins of the cities that we live and work in, then we would be able to understand how that infrastructure works and therefore get the most out of it with limited need for new infrastructure. But we can't do it because data is not freely available. We have issues around policy in terms of sharing of data, and I think that you need to have a national interest in digital twins in order to drive their creation. And I think pretty much nowhere in the world really are we seeing enough of a policy drive towards actually having these complicated digital twins. We have digital twins of individual things, but not the combined infrastructure.
There is maybe one resource also that we need to be very efficient about, which is land. So speaking of reusing buildings or reusing infrastructure, it's conserving land and making it available for forestry, biodiversity, et cetera, et cetera. It's so important to absorb carbon also. One of the features, one of the interests of having some nuclear in the energy equation is that nuclear concentrates a lot of energy in a very small space. So it uses anywhere between 100 and 500 times less land than alternative technologies to produce the same amount of energy. So I think therein lies one of the interesting aspects of this technology as part of the recipe to get us to where we need to get to.
Even though you say you haven't had to amend what you're doing at a place like Hinkley, which is a monster project, can you ever get to the point, do you think, Simone, where that can be declared a net zero site?
To be honest with you, I don't think so. I think that you've got to consider what the site does. So as I said, the site will produce, at the time of production, zero carbon electricity. Once you consider the impact that the construction period will have had on its output, it turns out to be actually 5.8 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. When you compare it with solar or wind, it's actually less than any other alternative technology. And the key reason is that the huge amount of energy is produced in a very small place, really. So, but you know, can those 5 grams be brought down to 0? The answer is, well, no, not now at least, not easily. Maybe in the future, you know, once we've got truly green steel or green, you know, cement, etc., maybe it will. But 5 grams is so much better than 500 or 1,000, which is, you know, a fossil technology is produced with. So I think in order to get to 0, we need to go from 500 to 5. Is already quite a way forward, and then, you know, we will sharpen the pencil and try to get to the last few grams.
Yvonne, the same question to you, given the great ambitions in the Republic, can you actually define a site as being net zero, do you believe? Are you moving to that position in the Green Building Council?
No, the main issue is we just don't have enough clean energy. Yeah, so that's a real problem. We need to import it likely. So we really require international cooperation, yeah, multilateral efforts in that respect. Yeah. But on that question about efficiency on existing infrastructure, earlier. I think the other way is to look at it from the embodied carbon aspect. You know, when you retain old structures, you know, the embodied. If you look at it from the embodied carbon framework, that provides a way to account for, you know, how much carbon you're actually saving by not building new structures. So I think one way forward for the infrastructure and the building space is to look at the embodied carbon of the things that we build, to be more mindful of that.
Mike and Steve, given what I asked Kathy about right at the beginning of the discussion about whether there are projects you decline to bid for unless they are moving in a sustainable direction, are you moving potentially to the point where you will not do a project, either of you, unless it can be declared as net zero as possible?
Yeah, I turn it around to state our strategic objective is that by 2025, 100% of all Jacobs programs and projects globally will be sustainable. Today we...
Net zero?
Yeah, all working for clients around mitigation, adaptation, carbon reduction, energy transition, all leading to a net zero future. And today we measure it that we're about a third, somewhere about 30 to 35% of our business is directly linked to sustainability and the topics that we're talking about. And we're going to be rapidly getting to the point where it's 100% by 2025.
So you will simply not do work if it violates those principles?
Right. Well, when I joined the company 6 years ago, I was joined because of my oil and gas and chemicals background to double the size of Jacobs, that business. 2 years later, we sold it, which is a third of the company, because we are committed to sustainability and we're committed to doing things that are going to help that industry. So we'll deliver sustainable solutions, but we're not designing and engineering any new refineries or chemical plants, because Jacobs is all about driving to a net zero carbon environment in infrastructure, defense, life science, electronics, all the industries that we serve.
Mike.
Yeah, so there are various ways of answering that question. I would say in very simple terms, we want to be a net zero company. And we fully understand that will include Scope 3 emissions at some point. And
your clients.
Absolutely. So it's exactly, Scope 3 will be about the projects that we work on. So I think we're great believers in being measured and having to honestly then deliver on what's being measured. So by 2040, earlier if possible, we'll be net zero. We're carbon neutral already. And so for us, this aim is very, very real. Along the way, we are already pulling away from projects, so we won't work on coal-fired power stations, as Kathy said earlier. We extend that to other elements of fossil fuels. So we recently pulled away from a heavy rail project, which is our bread and butter, you might say, is rail. But heavy rail, where a portion of that was going to be transportation of coal,
Was that in
And we
Australia?
said that's not...
Was that Australia?
It was in Australia, funnily enough. So absolutely we're pulling away from projects. We are actively working with other organizations to try and drive the measurement of carbon and therefore the reduction of carbon, having carbon management plans on projects. So past 2080, for example, which is a carbon management standard, we were partly responsible for authoring that. The work that we're doing with CCRI around making sure that investments actually take account of climate risk, so we're supporting that. So I'd like to think we're coming at this from different directions. One of them is advocacy, trying to make sure that actually all of us in the industry are given very serious targets that we have to meet. But in the meantime, there's stuff that you can do anyway. And we believe that we should be doing exactly that. We're an employee-owned business in Mott MacDonald, and you saw Heather and Kathy on the stage earlier, and Heather as an ECP. I have to be able to look Heather in the eye as the next generation of owners of my business and be able to say, we are doing everything that we can do to change this world, actually, within the expertise that we've got.
All right, let me pick up on 2 or 3 questions here. Michael Machin, one of the barriers I've faced is client engineers who have employed me, my company, to design a project, build a project as well, and then insist on changing the design to a less efficient green design to suit company standards or practices. How do you cope with that as the client pays the bill? Any recommendations? You're nodding, Simone.
This is a complex question because,
is there a simple answer?
To be honest with you, in the monster project that you refer to, our suppliers, our supply chain, sometimes they have to amend their design practices to fit the standards of the ONR, which is the Office of Nuclear Regulation, which is paramount. And maybe there will be occasions where the equipment, has to be made bigger or thicker or etc. So I don't know. Just to mention something, nuclear safety is paramount, and sometimes maybe there are changes induced to that. So there could be good reasons for that, but there could be also bad reasons, and we should avoid the bad reasons for sure.
Mike, Steve, anything you want to add quickly?
Any client that I've met in my 6 years of running Jacobs always says, challenge us. And so, I think clients are trying to get to the right answer, but I think they're also expecting companies like ourselves, including Simone, because we work with EDF very closely, but challenge us. Don't just accept what we say and go off and do it blindly if you got a better idea. And that's what companies like us that are global and we're working on different sectors to bring the best practices. And I think that's part of the culture that we've got to establish in a deeper way if we're going to get climate change achieved in the time frame that we want to achieve.
So I agree that the starting point should be that we've got expertise in this area, and we should be challenging our clients to make sure that they are changing specifications, they are doing things differently to make the projects greener, whatever that might mean in the particular instance. But it's hard. It's hard when you're doing this at a project level and you're on a site and you're delivering a project. Then it can get tough. It can get transactional, contractual. And I understand that, but I think Kathy said something earlier that something that we worked on years ago with the Green Construction Board, which was around the link between cost and carbon. So when it comes to if we're talking about green projects being lower carbon, if you really engage with a client and you really think about how you're going around the construction operations on a site, if you can lower carbon, then there's a strong chance that you're lowering cost. And I would even really encourage people that work in our sector, measure carbon when you're thinking about a design. When you're certainly when you're planning the construction of something, measure the carbon. Really work out where the carbon hotspots are, because chances are, if you do that, you'll come up with different ways of working, which will save carbon. But you know what? It'll save cost as well.
Question here from Ned Zeroni. No one size fits all. how are the panelists and their companies and projects incorporating local communities into new projects? And then Simone, I look at you because obviously with Sizewell coming down the track, that's going to be another enormous project on a beautiful bit of coastland.
Yeah, so engagement of local communities is paramount. We're working very hard. It's a central piece. I have to say that we also have technical tools, which are called in the UK Section 106 agreements, to compensate for the unavoidable impact and damage, literally, that happens as a result of construction project, be it in terms of traffic, of thousands of employees in a certain area of the country for a number of years, etc., which we did conclude, for example, with the Sizewell local communities, local councils, etc., to ensure that whatever impact there is that cannot be completely offset is compensated fairly through contributions to the local communities. But without the local communities, it's completely impossible to do these projects.
Whether in the developed countries or the developing world.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's exactly the same. I was working my previous job in a hydro projects in Africa, in Cameroon, or in Brazil, etc. I would say, you change the type of project, but you change the country, you change the context, but the end game is always the same. So you've got to make sure that the local communities understand what you're trying to do, feel respected, and when they are impacted, the impact is fairly compensated.
Let me ask you just 30 seconds each, or those of you who want to intervene. Chris Peacock, manager of DRATSAB, asked about the opportunities from digitization and data use in infrastructure and construction. Quickly, if you can, Yvonne, how much is that actually easing some of the problems we've been discussing in the last 40 minutes? Microphone, please.
Contribution, and digital twins, I think was mentioned earlier, is definitely one way forward to help us to see effects and on the digital scale before it's actually implemented on site. Yeah. So Singapore is really is really embracing digitalization in a really big way, yeah. Okay, I
Okay,
think we're
thank you.
running out of time.
All righty. And Steve and Mike.
Yeah, Nick, it's critical. Data, big data, artificial intelligence, machine learning, it's all critical if we're going to get there. And just an example, what I've found is we've been acquiring for our defense business and intelligence agencies in the US, all these classified high-tech companies that want to be owned by Jacobs because they see the opportunity to apply their digital data capabilities to infrastructure. And so I think it's a huge opportunity, and it's all part of the technology change that has to occur.
I think the simple answer is that we cannot achieve net zero in the infrastructure world, which represents 60 to 70% of all emissions. We cannot do it without digitally transforming our industry. Simple as that.
The big data gives you fantastic tools such as apps on your iPhone. So I'm just checking where the power is coming from in Britain at the moment. We are emitting 355 grams per kilowatt hour at the moment in Britain. Yes, 60% of the power is coming from burning fossil fuels, gas and coal at the moment. So we are at COP, but there is a long way to go. Why is that? Because there is not a lot of wind and there is not a lot of sun. And there is not enough nuclear, should I say. So there is a lot of work in front of us to get us to where we need to get to.
Can you actually design a power station, a nuclear power station on your iPhone?
Well, I don't think. Not yet.
Not yet.
But maybe, who knows? With the help of Mott, MacDonald and Jacobs, maybe one day we will.
Can I thank you all very much indeed.